Hey, what's going on, beautiful people? So, what's this video about? Well, I first got my Saturn in 1996. I wasn't, quite there for the 1995 launch because, mostly because if I even approached my parents asking for the Saturn at its launch price, my mum would have probably said,
"Hey man, I got 5 kids to feed."
But I knew the Saturn was the first next-gen system I wanted, even when coming off me owning and loving both the Mega Drive and the SNES, where towards the end, the SNES, probably took the crown for me, that generation. I got my Saturn not long after its launch here in the UK when the Model 2 variant released. This, very console you're seeing here being my original Saturn, which, is still going strong since 1996, and trust me, this thing has been played. From that moment on, the Saturn has remained one of my favorite consoles ever. Always fighting, for that top spot against the N64, a console, I didn't actually buy, for myself until 1998, but naturally, I was playing it, well before, I got my own N64, but, to get to the point, this video is basically me in full defense of the PAL Saturn's, UK library of games, that system got in its 3 years of life here in the UK, sharing, a similar lifespan to other Western countries, just 3 years, people. With the last official releases, I bought, myself being Burning Rangers and Shining Force 3 in late 1998. I nearly got Deep Fear, which I believe was the very last Saturn game released in the UK, but I foolishly let it pass me by every time I went into a game shop and saw it. Even after reading about it in my Saturn mags, being interested, because of my love for Resident Evil, especially the Saturn version. My only regret now being how much that bloody game costs. If I wanted to pick it up, something I'll never do regarding an official copy. Unless Crom, bless me with finding it for a reasonable price.
Crom.
In the PAL Saturn's life, I believe around 240 games were released in the UK. Now, first off, no average gamer, will both own and fully play 240 games for a single system in a single generation. My personal Saturn library, like 95% of the games I own, I bought during the Saturn's life, and I have about 90 games, with maybe 70 of those being PAL UK games. I was a pure, UK Saturn, player for the most part, back then. I bought, many brand new games at the time, of course, but also many second-hand games. I have fond memories of using my high school, lunch money at cash converters, buying myself cheap Sega Saturn games instead of eating for survival. Games were, clearly a priority over sustenance. So when people say to me the Saturn had a small library, or even the N64 had a small library, in comparison to the PS1, yes they did, we all know this, but if you owned just an N64 or Saturn, the N64 I believe having a similar number of PAL released games, then, I'm sorry, 99% of people weren't buying them all, or even owning as many as I have. Now, if we're talking about genres of games represented on these consoles, then I can see, the N64 argument, if you weren't a fan of specific genres. But I digress to that. We're here to talk about the Sega Saturn. Now, I've already shown all my Sega Saturn games on this channel, in some crazy video, where I have around 90 games as mentioned, and that's like 90 games, people. All pretty much bought in that 3-year UK Saturn generation, 95 to 98. Actually, for me, it was actually technically less than 3 years. As like I mentioned, I got my Saturn in 1996. And the console launched in mid-1995 in the UK. This was essentially my peak gaming era, where I was in sixth form of high school, later also working part-time in Electronics Boutique from 1997 till 2000, and also going to college during those years. All my spare time and money went on pretty much nightclubs and gaming. Back then, as I was still living at home with little financial commitments. And any of my close friends would tell you that I lived and breathed that era of gaming, and I owned all three major consoles, the Saturn, PS1, and N64, plus my PC. I wasn't, going to miss out on anything. Gaming is everything to me. But that leads me onto what I would call this clocked it fact. If you only owned just a PS1 or just a Saturn or an N64, or even just a PC during that generation, you were missing out. It's as simple as that. No arguments about it. This isn't me sitting here, strutting with my chest out because I was fortunate to own all systems. Both the PS1 and N64, I bought out of my own working money. With the Saturn being the last console my parents bought for me. I am fully aware of how fortunate I was, and I can only thank Crom for that. But hell, there would have been people who owned all those, plus like the Atari Jaguar and Neo Geo as well. Everyone's situations are different, right? But from living that generation and owning all three of those major platforms, between them all, I know full well that each system, had exclusives and multi-platform versions of games that just simply, in my opinion, were must-plays that generation. And this for me, not just as a Sega fanboy, or a Saturn fanboy, because remember, the N64 was not just my favorite system that generation, but it's my favorite console of all time. I also very much, loved, my PS1. I still play it to the day, and I still consider it Sony's best console, with the PS2 behind it. But between all those consoles and their games, the PAL Saturn library came in strong by itself, in my opinion, as a worthy console to own by itself in that generation, if that's how your situation fell. What I see a lot online these days in both the Saturn and general YouTube streets is that to really experience a Saturn, you need to also include the Japanese library. Whilst I fully understand this, agree that the full Saturn Japanese library is just peak gaming. I got a Japanese Saturn. I got my Japanese games. I also must strongly disagree with it being required for what I deem personally as a full Saturn experience, something which for me the PAL UK library delivered for me in its short life. That the Saturn Online has seen a recent resurgence, with more people starting to realize that the system had some unique bangers, and many strong multi-platform games from that, from certain developers. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that there weren't some stinkers, which let me point out every console that generation had, every console every generation has, but when the Saturn got it right, Crom, it did get it right. I moved through that generation of the Saturn, almost release by release for the games I was interested in, and I've actually taken notes of these games here because I just want to just not forget. But when I first got my Saturn, games like Virtua Fighter, Sega Rally, Panzer Dragoon, Bug, Clockwork Knight, Virtua Cop, Daytona USA, Theme Park, Rayman, Virtua Fighter 2, Guardian Heroes, Gun Griffin, Mysteria, Baku Baku Animals, Panzer Dragoon 5, Road Rash, Galactic Attack, which I have the Japanese version myself, which is called Layer Section, which I actually later picked up once I got my Japanese Saturn, because even though the PAL version passed me by, that game was there for those who wanted it, and it's in my opinion one of the greatest shooters ever. These games and many more were already out, by mid 1996, so I naturally snapped them all up, not at once, of course, but I got all these games, and my Saturn library, to me was already, peak. People can scoff at many games from that generation, mostly because of how they look now, but I'm sorry, when you were home back then, playing these games, like Sega Rally, Virtua Fighter, Panzer Dragoon, etc., on your TV for the first time. Those games were generational 3D marvels for their time. Absolutely blowing your socks off. As great video games should do. Basically, if you were coming straight from the Mega Drive and SNES, you went from peakness, from the peakness of like Starwing, to the peakness of Panzer Dragoon. Or you went from 2D visuals, like Sonic 3, to Rayman. The leap was magnificent, and especially for me and many others who grew up in the arcades, seeing games like, and playing games like Virtua Fighter and Sega Rally, and then seeing those porters home, so crammed down well, with me utterly loving the port, the original Virtua Fighter on the Saturn, not the remix one, and with me also saying back then, and still to this day, that the Saturn version of Sega Rally is better than the arcade version, and to me that's a clocked-in fact. I still love the look and vibe of Virtua Fighter on the Saturn, especially Sarah's stage, with that disco-like floor and beautiful, nighttime, cityscape. I'll put it on a screen, so just look at it. Once again, seeing such lifelike movements, from the first 3D fighting game ever, you simply just had to be there. And another thing, we played our games back then. I'm not saying that we don't now. Of course we do. But there were less games made back then. The arcade influence of gaming was still strong. So many games had that type of replay value, which is forgotten in many ways today in modern gaming. A video for another day perhaps. But arcade style gaming, was more than just a replay value. I didn't buy Virtua Fighter and Sega Rally just to let them sit there after the few races and fights, and then wait for sequels or other games to be released. Those games you played on a regular basis. They were evergreen titles, of that generation. And for me, I still return to them to this day. In many ways, they never left my yearly rotation of games since 1996. For me, even when new consoles released and dominated their generations, for my game time, I still had my old consoles hooked up and would have blasts on my favorite games. Great games, do that to gamers. They never leave your mind and heart. In my mind already, games like Sega Rally, Virtua Fighter 1 or 2, Guardian Heroes, Panzer Dragoon 1 and 2, Baku Animals, Virtual Cop, once again as quick examples. These were simply games you needed to experience and were exclusive to the Saturn, regarding the consoles at that time. Have you seen Panzer Dragoon 2 in all its 3D VDP2 epic glory? There was nothing like that game on the N64 or PS1, unless you count Lilac Wars or even Omega Boost, which isn't really an on-rail shooter. But trust me, Panzer Dragoon stands in an artistic realm of its own. But even technically, both the N64 and PS1 were incapable of replicating the Saturn's VDP2 Infinite Planes, which brought like a level of environmental scope utterly unique to the Saturn. I'll put it on the screen. Just look, at like the massive underground lake with those water, special effects in Panzer Dragoon 5.
Look at it!
Then, moving, forwards through 1996 and 97, we were getting games like Athlete Kings, Destruction Derby, Nights into Mother Fudging Dreams, plus Christmas Nights, Sega showing their peak freebie love. We were getting Virtual Cop 2, Exhumed, Resident Evil, Fighting Vipers, the Discworld games, Tomb Raider, Street Fighter Alpha 2, Command and Conquer, and this is me only selecting a handful of games to highlight that you were, if you were a general gamer with just a Saturn as your only console, if you were buying these games, you had more than enough great titles. You're both excellent, both exclusive and multi-platform to keep you entertained for months and years on end. And it's easy to forget, that we were still getting the emergence of new genres and IPs, many of which still, hold, dominance, to this day. It's like, do you remember, or I say, do you, if you don't, do you understand how big Tomb Raider was? To have this game come to the Saturn first and experience this 3D adventure, unlike anything you'd experienced before, damn straight. We were all capturing that perfect, camera angle of Lara Croft. We became obsessed. And, the world became obsessed with Lara Croft. Do you remember how good it was to control knights using the 3D analog controller? Something that, released virtually, at the same time as the N64's revolutionary, analog controller. Sega and Nintendo were constant innovators. The controls for knights were absolutely sublime, and still are to this day. We had peak light gun games like Virtual Cop 2, using the peak virtual gun. I've said peak so many times in this video, or the absolutely insane version of Exhumed, which I mentioned earlier, which admittedly I didn't get round to playing until like late, 97 or even 98, but it was there for the Saturn, for those ready to pick it up at launch. Games like this and Turok, were our early, Metroid Primes, some of the same devs actually. I mean, even if I just like, showed you like the lighting on this, on Exhumed in this game.
Look at it!
We were marveling at new tech like this. Athlete Kings, as another example, is the best Olympic game of that generation in my opinion, and graphically smokes like a number of games available on all platforms that generation. The Saturn once again making full use of its high-res 60 FPS VDP2 sexual goodness. Listen, I could roll all the way through 1997 to 98 and big up releases like Virtual On, Dark Savior, Die Hard Arcade, Puzzle Fighter, Saturn Bomberman, Fighters Megamix, Shining Holy Ark, Warcraft 2, Dragon Force, Wipeout 2097, Sonic R, Enemy Zero, Panzer Dragoon Saga, Shining Force 3 and Burning Rangers and others, right? For me, all games for the Saturn and for that generation that simply needed to be experienced. And for me, once again, I had all those systems that generation. I was a busy ass gamer, living peak gaming existence. Imagine then also bouncing between releases like Mario 64 on the N64, then Virtua Fighter 2 on the Saturn, Final Fantasy 7 on the PS1, GoldenEye, Panzer Dragoon, Parappa the Rapper, and so forth. The libraries of all these machines were just amazing, absolutely amazing. But still, even if I owned just a Saturn, I'd be loving it. And I can still say this because I didn't buy my PS1 until like 1997. So I had my Saturn for like nearly a year before the likes of Final Fantasy 7, Parappa the Rapper, and Oddworld called me over to the sunny dark side. With like Oddworld, I was being developed for for the Saturn. I wanted it on my Saturn, but it came to the PS1. I would still follow the games, and of course, like I said, if you own one system, you're going to be jealous of games released on other consoles. You're going to be jealous of Final Fantasy 7. You're going to be jealous of Ocarina of Time. But then, if you just had your Saturn, you're just a PS1 owner or the N64 owner, you're going to be jealous of Shining Force 3. You're going to be jealous of Panzer Dragoon Saga and Fighters Megamix and Saturn Bomberman, all this stuff. The point of this video was to highlight that the PAL UK Saturn, with the games it had, its accessories and the console itself, were more than worthy that generation to stand by itself as a strong library of games for the player, with exclusives and multi-platform experiences that simply needed to be played and could only be played on our system. You don't, I don't want this to sound too hard, but you don't need the Japanese library on top of the PAL library to grant you a fantastic Saturn experience. Because I had not just a fantastic Saturn experience, but one that impacted my gaming life and just life forever, all based on the games that released in the UK. I got my Japanese Saturn like 2003, and then I picked up those Japanese Saturn games that never came to the UK. But my main core Saturn life was the PAL library. And I'd easily argue the same about the N64. Of course, these machines had their problems with their software library. In total, the size of the PS1 library confirms that. I'm not here in full defense of everything. What hurt me and many Saturn owners the most was the fact that we knew many games that came to the PS1 were being planned for the Saturn, but were scrapped for reasons like the system started to sell badly in the West. Mostly down to Sony's massive marketing campaign. Devs struggling more with the Saturn's 2 CPUs, which is quite ironic today. Many key games removed from the system. Often through money under the table. By Sony. These just the facts. Oh hell. Even developers stolen in order to make games like Tekken to compete with Virtua Fighter. There's a wealth of reasons. Sega to blame in many areas as well. But that doesn't take away from the system that we had and the games that we got and what the Saturn ended up being, which is still in my eyes just more than worthy. Now, of course, if you're going to play the Saturn through emulation, which most people will these days, you instantly have access to every game ever released. But here's what I'd suggest. Start from the beginning. Work your way through the release schedule. Pick the games that you feel you would like, or games you feel you would have, tried or bought in that era, based on what was released in that era, and experience the Saturn, as it grew through its short life. Even if it had, a slightly longer life in Japan, and even if you just play the PAL or Western release library, I can assure you that you will find a great number of exclusive bangers, showing you that the Saturn had its own magic, regardless of what all the negative marketing and still to this day YouTube videos, say around it, because that people will tell you otherwise, But that's it. If you stay to the end, thanks for listening. I didn't want this to be too much of a rant. This is just pure passion from me and the Sega Saturn and just Sega in general. But for the Saturn, for this particular video, just pure passion of someone who's that console means the world to me, and did at the time, even in that era, of strife for us Sega fans. But yeah, let me know your thoughts on the Saturn. I'll reply to everyone as usual. Thank you very much for listening, and most of all, stay beautiful, people.